Good evening. Good to see you all. It's hard to see you all out there. I want to do a traditional Ojibwe greeting to bring my ancestors into the room. Stand person. That does. I think I will go to a microphone. Sound. Hello, hello. How about now? No? Hello? Oh, much better. Goodness. All right, let's start again. Hi. How's it going this evening? Excellent. It's wonderful to see your beautiful, bright faces. I want to thank my comadres, my sisters, for starting us off in such a beautiful way. Regina Lopez Whiteson, what a beautiful opening, and your grandchildren. Thank you, Chini Witch, for your words and for your presence. That is honoring the people of the land. We are hearing the voices of the people of this land whose ancestors have been here since time immemorial. As Native people, land acknowledgement is not a fact. It is not a recent occurrence. It is our traditional obligation that when we go to someone else's territory, we ask for permission. We acknowledge their ancestors. We acknowledge their histories in the land. We also acknowledge their contemporary communities, whether they're part of a tribal nation or not, that they are here. We are still here. And there are future generations, the young ones, their faces are coming up from the ground, from the earth. The new ones will be born. And so for us, land acknowledgement is simply being polite, being a good guest, being a visitor in someone else's territory. And as Indigenous peoples, I've been honored to travel to Aotearoa, to the Sami people of the Arctic, the Quechua people of the Andes. Wherever you go, we do that. We acknowledge the first peoples of the land and give thanks and gratitude and know that their ancestors are in the land, their spirits are with us, and their living human communities are here today. So thank you again, that was beautiful. And thank you also for the incredible poetry and the words of remembrance from so many beautiful Native poets and beautiful stories of our responsibilities to the land. So I bring you as relatives. Melissa Nelson and Dishinkas. Makuntiga wiki dashin go. Nina Anishinaabe Ekwe, Kishu Deng. Then Miknat Wajiwing, Truman Chippewa, Ninjiba. And you, Miigwech. I say greetings to you all as relatives. My name is Melissa Nelson. My Ojibwe name is Makunti Gawik. I am a proud member of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Band, mixed heritage Native woman of the Lynx clan, and I'm really honored to be here tonight. I thank your professor, Dr. John Hausdorfer, for the invitation. Where's John? Hey, thank you. We worked together on many different projects. What kind of ancestor do you want to be? And some other events. So I'm very happy to be here with you all. And I want to dive in to my presentation. The light is a little extra bright. Can you take it down so we can see the slides a little better? If not, that's fine. Can you see it okay? Yeah, great. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about land back and land rematriation. You guys up for that? Excellent. And I look forward to a good discussion with you afterwards. Better. I'm coming to you. Yep. Technology is not my friend tonight. There we go. Did you have to do it?
Nope, I think you got it. Try back.
I think there's a delay, but anyway, I'll stick here. Anyway, I always like to start with a little bit about my positionality, who I am, where I come from, so you know. We're all different, and this is part of my story. So I told you about the first part. I was born and raised in Northern California. I was born near the headwaters of the South Fork of the Eel River. And so watersheds are very important to me, and I'm just really happy to be at a watershed conference. The watershed has so many incredible metaphors embedded in it, and to live at the source of water so that we know what's upstream and what's downstream, to help us clear up our watersheds, both upstream, downstream, as it reaches the ocean. So I have been a part of the Eel River watershed on the homelands of the Seagoe and Yuki and Caddo people of Northern California. And that's where this being was raised as a guest on those territories. I then have lived in other parts of Northern California, primarily in the San Francisco Bay Area, in the lands of the Ohlone people, the Coast Miwok people, and the Southern Pomo people. And so I'm a guest in their homes, and much of my knowledge and experience of land back has been assisting the nations of California, many of them who suffered a brutal genocide due to Spanish colonization and the gold rush and other impacts. And so many of them are without land. So there is a real need to do land back in California. So several of my case studies will be about those people. And also, I want to share a little bit about the people I come from. My mother, Teresa Davis Waiter Nelson, was a member of the Chippewa band. That means we come from people known as Anishinaabe or Ojibwe or Chippewa, with 3 different names. And also French settlers, going back to the French fur trade. And we mix, becoming the Métis Nation of Canada, or the Indigenous people of our reservation. And then through my dad, a settler Norwegian. So I too am a product of the colonizer and the colonized, and a mixed race person who really worked to try to resolve that and understand what it means to be a settler, to be native, and to also honor the first peoples of the land with land back and land rematriation. To you? All right. So today I'm going to talk about 3 key areas. Land as medicine. That's the first part. The second part will be the disease of displacement. And that is a term by the great Karina Walters, a wonderful Native health educator from the University of Washington, who wrote a very important article about the disease of displacement with colonial impacts. And third, the land back movement, really mending our relations, which I think most of you are interested in here tonight. But we need to understand some history and background to know where we've been, to know where we're going. So for us, the Ojibwe people, when we talk about land, we are also talking about medicine. The word for land is aki, and the word for medicine is mashkiki. And that word mashkiki is made up of 2 words, one for strength and one for earth. So for us, we get our medicines from the earth, and the earth is medicine. So they're synonymous. So it's not just, when we talk about land back, it's not just finding a place to live, right? It's not just talking about a little plot of land to call home. It's actually about restoring a relationship with medicine, that which gives us life, that which can heal us. Sorry for this delay. Excellent. This is a little bit more background about my nation, the Anishinaabe Confederacy. We're actually made up of 3 distinct tribes known as the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Ottawa, or the town Ottawa, the city comes from, Ottawa. And we are part of the Three Fires Confederacy and also part of the Seven Fire Confederacy, which I write about in our book, What Kind of Ancestors You Want to Be. And so we have our creation stories and origin stories are very deep and profound, like every Indigenous peoples. They're very complex. I don't have time to share with you today all of them. But one of the most important stories is actually our migration story. It talks about how we originally came from the East Coast and how we were part of the bright salty waters of now today Maine, Nova Scotia, where the Mi'kmaq people are. And we had a prophet over 1,000 years ago. Some say a couple of thousand years ago, but many think around 1,000 years ago. We had a prophet who said that an evil wind was coming from the east and that we would perish if we did not move west and move inland. And so there were many council fires, much discussion. People had to decide to listen to the prophet. And finally, after great council discussion and dialogue, it was decided that our nation would leave their homeland on the East Coast and move inland up the St. Lawrence Seaway to the land where the food grows upon the water to find a new homeland. And so our people migrated over 7 fires. It was predicted and foretold by our prophet that we would find a new home and that we would find new people and we would meet new people and we would mix and trade and intermarry and move forward because an evil wind was coming from the east. And so our people started this long, arduous migration in our birch bark canoes up the river, in our camps with our bundles and our beaver skins. And we moved up and we found all these different places along that pathway. And you'll see many of them. The city of Montreal is actually one of our traditional sites where we met with the Mohawk Nation. And we mixed with the Mohawk Nation. And we made a treaty with the Mohawk Nation to create peace amongst our nation. And then we moved further inland throughout the Great Lakes, and we have many different stories. And that's why the Ojibwe Nation, or the Anishinaabe Confederacy, is one of the largest tribes in North America. We cover 5 US states and 4 Canadian provinces. So we're a very large nation and very diverse, although we speak the same Algonquin core language. My people ended up in the Minnesota area in the Lake of the Woods on the Canadian side and White Earth area on the Minnesota side. And then further got pushed out into the plains. So the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa are one of the few plains Ojibwe. We left the homeland of the woodlands, but we found the Turtle Mountains, and they're like a little island of woodlands in the middle of the northern plains. And so that has been our homeland just for a couple hundred years. And Indigenous cosmologies and worldviews directly tie us to the land. According to one of our other creation stories, we were part of Skywind falling. And people understood of that story from the Haudenosaunee, the 6 Nations. Many of the northeastern tribes have that story. So we came from the sky, and many stories are coming through the stars and through a great tree of life. We also have stories of coming from underneath the great primal sea in the oceans, an earth diver story, where all of Turtle Island emerged from a little handful of soil that our muskrat gathered under the primal sea and put on the back of turtle to create Turtle Island. So we come from the sky, we come from the earth, and we come from the waters. And also one of our great creator heroes, Nanabuju, who is part human, part spirit, a trickster, a shapeshifter, a trans individual, and they are born of a human mother and a spirit father that is usually characterized as the north wind or the west wind. So we are deeply connected to the breath of life. And so when Native people talk about land is everything, it's not a metaphor, right? It's not just a saying. And for all of us as human beings, as the Navajo would say, the people of the Five-Fingered Clan, we all know that our food comes from the land. Our waters come from the watersheds, and the beautiful rain cycle that connects the cloud beings, the rains, the land, the oceans, the lakes, the rivers. So we are connected to that water cycle, and we cannot grow our food without that water. So land gives us all these beautiful things that ecologists would call ecosystem services. But we don't like to monetize and commodify these beautiful natural cycles like that. We know that our mashiki is the land. Land is medicine for us. Again, not a metaphor, a reality of trees and foods and minerals and clays. And also our languages come from the land, right? Each language is distinct. We have many diverse languages in Turtle Island, North America, because our lands are so distinct. Our cultural diversity emerges from that biological diversity, and we people are guardians of that our cultural diversity that comes directly from the land. So all of our stories come from that mountain, that spring, those buffalo, that herd of antelope, that little muskrat who builds under the sea and sacrificed its life to bring a little pot full of dirt up to Turtle to make land. All of those animal relatives, they give us stories, and that comes directly from the land. And those stories are different ways of knowing, are different ways of learning. As Robert Kimmerer says, the land is teacher. You just have to listen. Whereas Leanne Simpson says, land as pedagogy. Land as pedagogy. The way that we learn is through observing, not mimicking, although I am a supporter of biomimicry, but we do not exactly mimic natural processes. We harmonize with natural processes. We observe. Those are indigenous knowledge systems. So the land gives us all of this and so much more. We often also think of Native people purely as land-based people, right? When people think of indigenous people, we are people of the earth, the red earth people, the land people, which is so true. But also we don't recognize that the land is a mirror of the sky world. And again, that is in our creation stories, that is in our origin stories, that as above, so below. How many people have heard that saying? As above, so below. We are a mirror of each other. And so just last night flying in, I was like, I've never been to Gunnison, I'm out in the middle of nowhere, it was dark. I didn't know where I was going exactly. I trusted John and everyone that I get there. And I looked out the window of the plane, and there was the beautiful moon, and there was Jupiter, and there was Pleiades. I'm at home. I'm at home with the stars. There they are. I'm in a new place, but there they are. And so our navigation, our timing, our moon cycles, women's cycles, our fertility cycles, everything is tied to the celestial beings, not just the earthly beings, because they are an intimate relationship. And that's what our creation stories often tell us. I was recently with some Maori friends, and they had some really great stories. And I won't get into it, but maybe later. But they're a little, not raunchy, but they talk about the relationship between Sky, Father, and Mother Earth in very interesting ways. I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, the land also ties us to the past because our ancestors are literally buried in the land. Historic things happen there, historic battles, we lost people there. Historic events, sacred sites, ceremonial events, prophetic events, that all those memories are in the land with those stories. And that's why colleague Romari ethnobotanist Enrique Simon says, we live in moral landscapes. Moral landscapes. The land tells us how to be a good person, what's right and wrong, because our stories remind us of when our tricksters did something there that wasn't correct and made a mistake. So for us, that is all embodied in the land. As people who were considered, quote, illiterate, we were not illiterate, we had intricate languages with intricate writing systems, that they were embodied in rock art, in birch bark scrolls, in pottery designs, in basket weaving designs, in arborglyphs on trees. There are many different ways that we actually created language and maps for each other to read, orally and in writing. And that was depicted again within the landscape, so that when the settlers came, they couldn't see it, they didn't understand it. That's why they said we were illiterate, but we actually weren't at all. And so the land tells us our past, and it also tells us our future. When we see the 7 oak death on the oak groves in California, the poem Coast people get very worried. Will there be acorns for my grandchildren? Will they be able to come and harvest here? When the Winnemucca people try to fish for salmon, and there are no salmon that year, how can you be a salmon people without salmon? Where will their children be? How can their children continue to be Winnemucca without that salmon? And so the land also tells us about the future generations. Again, if we read the signs in the land. One of my great teachers and elders, the great Leroy Wilbear. How many people have heard of Leroy Wilbear? Not too many. He is a Blackfoot leader from the Blackfoot Confederacy, or the Blood Tribe in Canada and Alberta. He's received numerous honorary doctorates. He really wanted to be a quantum physicist. He has a great love of physics, but his elders told him, well, you have a mind for the law, so you're going to become a lawyer. And so he had to sacrifice his personal desires to study physics to go into law. He started the Native American Law Center at Harvard University and founded the American Studies Department at the University of Alberta Lethbridge. And in my own land backstory, which I'll get to shortly, with the Cultural Conservancy, he came to our land when we asked for permission from the Coast Miwok and Southern Como leaders of land to engage in this land back project. And we had wonderful gift exchange and ceremonial dialogue. And then he stood up and shared words, the elders shared words. And one of the things that he shared with us that came to him while we were there is that we find our cultural resilience in the medicine of the land. We find our cultural resilience in the medicine of the land. And that became just such a touchstone for me, because again, when we talk about land back, we think of all of the ecological components, all the animals, all the plants, and we think of our people, our ancestors, we think of justice, and we think of our resilience for the future, and how for actually all of us, our cultural resilience is rooted in the medicine of the land, if we only recognized it. And in that medicine of the land, we find many things, and we remember many things. We remember that Corn Mother, that we come from corn. Many of the nations of the Americas, from Oaxaca, Mesoamerica, down in South America, Mandamin, the corn came all the way up into Canada. And this is such a source of life for so many of the indigenous peoples of the world, mais, the milpas. And so when we get back our land, we can plant corn again. We can plant our relatives. We have a space for our food sovereignty and to have our identity connected to those first foods, those sacred foods. We also have places for our animal relatives, like the Bear Nation. I'm related to the bear through my name. Many are members, Winona Duke is part of the Makwadoding, the Bear Clan. Many Ojibwe leaders are part of the Bear Clan. They are a little bear, it's related to the bear. And for us, I have habitat, healthy habitat for the bear relatives. And we have stories of when women used to marry bears. So we have very deep relations with the Bear Nation. And when we get our land back, we have homes for what we call wildlife habitat. Again, for us, it's so our relatives can thrive. We also remember our relationship to the great Mother Ocean. Even inland tribes like the Paiute of Nevada, they talk about coming from ocean women. And they talk about the importance of seashells. The Autumn people where I currently work and live in Arizona, in the Salt River Valley, talk a lot about the importance of the sea and the shells and those migrations to get salt. So no matter if you're in the middle of Turtle Island or on the edge, you remember the ocean and your relationship to the ocean. And so land back is part of connecting to those oceans again, with many of the coastal tribes I'm working with in California really need that access for their food and their identity. And for us, doing our land back means that we are rooted in our original instructions. These are the first teachings, the lessons that came to us from our creation stories, from our spirit mentors, from our oral traditions. For me, as an Ojibwe person, we talk about no Rematriation. No Rematriation. We talk about Maraki Ninawabu. We talk about the good life. We talk about living a good life, an ethical life, a healthy life, a flourishing life, in community with all our relations. Rematriation is continuous rebirth. It is flourishing with everything. And all nations have these kinds of concepts. Every nation does. For the Chippewa people of the Andean range, the beautiful mountains of South America, they talk about Sumak Kausai. Sumak Kausai. For them, this is the good living in harmony with all of life, with the mountain spirits, with the llamas, with all of the plants that live there, all of the beautiful potatoes, the papas in that area. For the Hawaiian people and all the Pacific Islanders have very similar concepts. Malama Aina, you take care of the land, so the land takes care of you. You nourish the land, and the land nourishes you. So land back means we go back to these original instructions and these teachings so that we can again live a good life for all of us. And it would be great for you to think about from your own tradition some of those original instructions, because all ancient traditions have them. We just forgot a lot of them. Now we get to the disease of displacement, and that life came to an abrupt halt. Not to overly romanticize it, we were not just the ecologically noble savage. Native peoples fought with each other, pushed out territories. My own Chippewa, we went into Minnesota. We had to work with the Dakota people, and that did not go well. We had long battles with the Dakota and Lakota and other groups in the Minnesota area. And after a while, we made peace, and we have treaties. One of my ancestors helped create the sweet corn treaty between the Dakota and the Chippewa people. And so we do have these histories that were far from perfect. Native people are like all people. We make mistakes, but how do we learn from those mistakes? And so even though we had some issues, we were really pretty well. And then colonialism happened. This little thing called colonialism and imperialism and the history of this country that we're still dealing with the injustice and the legacies. There were physical and cultural acts of genocide supported by the federal government, supported by states. There was massive displacement and dislocation from our ancestral territories, forced relocations. Then there was the removal, enclosures into reservations and reserves. There was also the spirit wars, the indoctrination into foreign religions, foreign ways. Our native spiritualities and religions were outlawed. Our drums were burned. Our languages were silenced. We were forced and marched into boarding schools that were like prisons for children. And finally, that dirty little secret about residential schools and boarding schools is finally coming out in America. Native people have been talking about this forever. And it was those children showing up just a couple of years ago in those full unmarked cemeteries up in Canada that created some dialogue about this and reconciliation. Then there were, of course, treaty violations. Even though treaties were negotiated, all of them have been violated. And Native people tribal who are part of the treaties, unfortunately, the US government has not upheld as part of those treaties. And then we get to settler colonialism, the ongoing onslaught of land theft, land loss, assimilation that continues today. So just to give a little indication of what was lost during this time, I love this group called the Decolonial Atlas. If you don't know them, check them out. They have free maps online that literally turns your world upside down. They completely disrupt settler cartography and are creating new ways of mapping our lands and our territories. And you'll see all of our beautiful Turtle Island in white there. That was all Indigenous land from pre-colonial times. So we'll say over 500 years ago, pre-Columbus. And then today, those black areas, that's all we have left. So 97%, it's hard to exactly measure and quantify, but approximately somewhere 96, 97% really was lost. And then the sun has began to get restored. In California, less than 1% of the native lands are in native hands. You can see that big white area. In California, pre-colonial times was the most densely populated area in North America, next to Oaxaca, Mexico City areas. So there was a massive, massive genocide that happened there. And so we have very little land left, and this is why we need land back. There's enough land for everyone, right? There is enough land for everyone. So some of the other impacts of settler colonialism, obviously the destruction of the native landscapes and our relatives, what is often called ecocide. So the buffalo is the most poignant, probably, and blatant examples of turning a lifeblood of our people, the buffalo, the bison nations, that roam from way up in Canada, all the way down to Mexico, over into California, way over to Alabama. The native bison population was so huge and fed so many people. And they were so good for the lands, and just stimulating aquifers and grasslands and redistributing seeds. As the Leroy Wilbear says, who's one of the founders of the Buffalo Treaty, Buffalo are the best ecologists. And because they are so good at treating the native landscape and making bird habitat and so many other things. And so they are a symbol of the decimation of native peoples. Some say as many as 30 to 40 million that were slaughtered, down to about 2,000 to 3,000. And fortunately today, thanks to the revitalization and resurgence efforts of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Lakota Nation, Takanka Oyate, the bison are coming back. The bison are on the rise. And so we are very, very grateful for that. But they were on the brink of extinction. And so that led to government rations. For the first time, Native people knew a type of starvation they had never known before, as prisoners on their own reservation lands. And so there was something that many call nutritional genocide or nutritional injustice and starvation on reservations. These enclosures and Indian allotments, many, many millions of native lands were lost through the Indian Allotment Act of 1887, where in just 50 years, over 90 million acres moved from Indian hands to non-native hands through the Indian Allotment Act. And so there were many different forms of land expropriation and land theft. And one of the most egregious ones that Native people talk about was the desecration of our sacred sites. And we have so many sacred sites. I'll just mention one, Greyhorn Butte, also known as Devil's Tower. Anytime you hear something called Devil's Tower, the Devil's Lake, or Devil's Mountain, you can pretty much safely say it was a sacred site to Native people. And then when the early settlers came in, they saw Native people doing ceremony there and thought it was something devilish because there was fire and furs and drums and dancing. I don't get it, but somehow it was translated as pagan, and therefore they often labeled them devil places. The Devil's Tower, Wyoming is part of the national park and a very sacred site to Native peoples. There's been many, many different issues about land use there. And I also want to mention the land health nexus. I think this is really a key part of the disease of displacement and the need for land back. And that is that anytime you see significant land loss happen, you also see a rise in health disparities for the Native people. And Denise Livingston is a wonderful Navajo activist and sister who's coined the word diabetes. Did that go off? Hello. Can you hear me anyway? Yeah.
I can't hear you one more.
Let's try this again. Hello, hello, hello. There's that feedback. Hello? I still hear it here. Anyway, Denise has coined the term diabetes, the onslaught of diabetes and obesity that has been a consequence of land loss. Sorry, I didn't We're gonna go old school. This one here?
This little owl right here on the
Oh, this thing.
that's because the audio just books on.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so you can hear me in the back? Woo-woo. So the impacts of land loss has led to significant health impacts for Native peoples. I think one of the most illustrative, poignant stories is from the Mandan people up in North Dakota. And when Garrison Dam went in on the Missouri River in the 1950s, middle 1950s, before that time, there was basically no diabetes. There was no diabetes in their community. And then once the dam went in on their river, the diabetes rate went up significantly. And now there's many different ecological or nutritional reasons for that, but some of the elders saw it very spiritually. And they said, when you dam up our river, you're cutting off the flow of our nutrients and the flow of our waters. So as above, so below, what happens to the land happens to the people. When you dam the rivers, our sacred river and our source of life, you dam the waters in our being. And that's when diabetes became an epidemic for the Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa people. And that was a story told to me by some elders in that community. And again, you can see it with graphs that it happens. And again, this is the work of Karina Walters from the University of Washington, who really looks at the disease of displacement with Alaska Natives, with Native Americans, with Hawaiians, all over the place. Now the fun part, now the fun part. We got through that, but we had to, right? We had to get through that. Now we're going to look at the movement, the resurgence that has really been happening for centuries. You can say land back started the minute Columbus stepped foot on Turtle Island. We have been working towards land back because land was being taken. But in the last 20 to 30 years, some may see 50 years since the Red Power movement and the historic occupation of Alcatraz. Some may say in the last 5 or 10 years since the racial justice movement. has really forged a real effort to reconcile with past injustices. Whatever it is, there is a global movement and a national movement and a local movement here in Gunnison for land back. And I'm very happy to see that at this university. And so this is about returning our relatives, returning our health, returning our justice, returning our dignity. So the Indian Collective is a wonderful Indigenous organization out of South Dakota, although they have people all over the nation. And they have really taken a leadership role in the land back movement. They have a wonderful website, Land Back U. They have an online university that has some videos and modules, and they're taking a very global perspective of land back. And I really want to root us and ground us in some of their language, which is a very particular political dimension of land back. And there's many different dimensions of land back, just there are diversity of Native peoples. But I thought that their language was very, very relevant. Land back is a movement that has existed for generations with a long legacy of organizing and sacrifice to get Native lands back into Native hands. And I highlight sacrifice because for Native people, this is an intergenerational effort. There have been people who have been working for land back for multiple generations. Currently, there are land back battles being fought all across Turtle Island, to the north and to the south. Land back is more than just a campaign, it is a political framework that allows us to deepen our relationship across the field of organizing movements working towards true collective liberation. I like that. I think we all want true collective liberation, right? For all of us, for all beings. It allows us to envision a world where Black, Indigenous, and people of color liberation coexists. It is our political organizing narrative framework from which we do their work. If you don't know Indian Collective, please check them out. They have wonderful toolkits and resources, online videos, and campaigns that all people can get engaged with. I also have been deeply involved with the land rematriation movement in California, led largely by the Segura Te Land Trust, a wonderful organization, the first Indigenous women urban-led Native land trust. And I've been very honored to be on the founding board of this wonderful organization with the dynamic Ohlone leader, Karina Gould, and many, many others. And they too have wonderful and extraordinary resources on their website for more information. They have a land rematriation toolkit as well. And we have a chapter coming out in a journal next year about the history of the formation of Segura Te Land Trust. And here are a couple of quotes from that article. Rematriation resists patriarchal settler colonialism and control of land. Rematriation encourages a return of land and associated relatives to women's leadership, women's care, and women's relationships. Rematriation as an embodied practice of recovery and return. It's about revitalizing the relationships between Indigenous lands, our heritage, our bodies, and it's based on our Indigenous values and our own ways of knowing, being, and doing. And really simply put, rematriate is to restore a people to their rightful place in sacred relationship with their ancestral lands. I'm all for that. Are you all for that? I think we can do that. Let's do that. Yes. And there are many different ways to return Native lands to Native hands. The land back movement, as connected to the Indian Collective, are doing a wonderful job at a strong political campaign with using law and regulations and policy and direct protest when needed. The land rematriation movement being led by Segura Te and many other Indigenous women's movements across the US, and also the seed sovereignty movement and the seed rematriation movement led by the wonderful Rowan White are all powerful ways that women especially, but men too, are really wanting to
embody this concept of returning to the mother, returning to the sacred feminine, returning to the earth in healthy, positive ways. But again, there are many different ways to do it. There are land rights and land tenure law cases and legal cases being battled in courts have been going on for generations, and some of them successfully, with a recent case I'll mention. The Native Land Trust movement has been very successful. In fact, I think one of the most successful, because the land trust movement of the environmental community has been such a great way to use conservation easements and co-management agreements to protect cultural habitat or to protect endangered species habitat. And now we can protect cultural habitats in sacred places. The Indigenous-led conservation movement that's happening at Bears Ears and other protected areas is also an exciting example. There is a growing Indigenous protected areas movement in Canada, with also examples internationally. Also in Canada, they talk a lot about land guardianship, and the concept of guardianship is also used a lot in the Pacific Islands. Kaitiakitanga is a very common term you'll hear a lot in New Zealand by the Maori people, to be the guardians of our past, the guardians of our lands and waters and our rivers, the rights of our rivers, and guardians of the future. Co-management is also an important tool and strategy for getting native hands back into native lands for stewardship. There are some who are creating eco-villages and wanting to bring back language as the central focal area of developing new villages and home sites. And then biocultural heritage is also a very important concept that's being used by the IUCN and UNESCO and a lot of the international agencies to protect Indigenous lands and cultures. One great example of that I mentioned earlier is the Parque de la Papa, the potato park in the Andes that is protecting all of the potato varieties for agrobiodiversity, but also protecting the languages, the stories, the songs of the Quechua and Aymara people who have been stewarding and in relationship with those potatoes and other food crops for millennia. So there are many different ways to do land back. There's not just one recipe or one size fits all. And again, we want to bring our lands back for our food sovereignty, for our languages, for our culture, for justice, for political recognition. But as Vine Deloria Jr. reminds us, the land is not just there for human use and even our human relationships. The land needs time of its own. This is a powerful quote. It's not that Indians should have exclusive rights there to any land base. It's that that location is sacred enough, it should have time of its own, right? And that the land itself needs time of its own, especially with growing recreation and growing land use and growing populations. We always need to protect areas so that these places have time of their own. I think I'll pass through this in the interest of time, just to remind you all that there are over 500 nations in the US alone. So we have great diversity of many different nations and tribes and people and languages and stories. There are also many unrecognized tribes that were not privileged enough to have treaties or they were terminated. And many tribes do not have recognition as sovereign nations and have no reservation land. And they desperately need reconnections to their ancestral places. And then there are many intertribal entities, which I'm a part of, that are coalitions of intertribal communities, like the Intertribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council, which was the first land trust in the world or in the US, and that was based in California to protect the ancient forests. But these are just some of the strategies and tools that are used by different Native people to get their land back. And we're using many different tools and ways to do it. And this is another wonderful map offering from the Great Decolonial Atlas. And this demonstrates just a handful of the land back projects in 2 years. So this movement is growing significantly. And this looks primarily at government land, but like I just mentioned, a lot of the land back is being done through private land as well, with people bequeathing their land or donating it back or selling it half price or doing other ways of transferring land title to Native communities and to sovereign nations. So this is a wonderful example of, you know, the size also, and some say size matters, and yes, it does. And also sometimes symbolic returns matter. I work in San Francisco and Oakland, some of the most expensive land in the world. And sometimes 1 acre of land there can mean so much for the people. Whereas in other areas, you want 10,000 acres, you want 20,000 acres, you want millions of acres. So you can bring down the buffalo, or you can have grizzly bear habitat, or you can other kinds of land use for conservation. But as you'll see here, some of the largest land back projects, the ones in red, have been the federal government returning land that was wrongfully taken. And I think this is a really exciting model and example, especially with the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, which I'll get to in a minute. There's also, as I mentioned, the land guardianship in Canada, and I do a lot of work in Canada, given my tribe was a border tribe, and even my grandparents were back and forth in Canada before there was a border there. So up in Canada, they're experimenting with tribal parks and creating these unique types of protected areas that they even have an acronym for, IPCA, the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas. They have a whole national movement funded by the federal government called Conservation Through Reconciliation, and they're returning land through reconciliation processes. They have an Indigenous guardianship network that trains young people. Like, we go to college, you can get out of high school and say, I want to be a land guardian. And you can get scholarships and get cited with elders who teach you how to do moose hunting, watershed restoration, ecoforestry, all these different traditional ecological knowledge practices for land guardianship. And then there's all ongoing political resistance. First Nations in Canada are no stranger to that. The tiny house warriors are fighting for lands up in BC to this day right now, mainly women-led. But they go back with the history of land protection through various protests and direct action. And so the organization that I've been so honored to work with for 30 years this year, the Cultural Conservancy, our motto going back 30 years ago was returning native lands to native hands. It didn't go so well then. It's going a lot better today. There is more recognition for how important this is. And we were very fortunate, after helping many tribes, including a lot of California Native communities, gain back access to and control of their own lands, and helping create land trusts and conservation easements for unrecognized tribes. After about 28 years of doing that with and for other communities, finally it was time to get some land of our own. And it was offered. We didn't ask for it, but it was offered, and we took the opportunity. So the Cultural Conservancy is a Native-led Indigenous rights organization based in San Francisco, with farms in Coast Miwok and Southern Como Territory, also known as Sonoma and Marin counties. And in 2019, we purchased at half price an old farm in Sebastopol, California, with the permission of the local sovereign nation, to create an Indigenous oasis for the local communities and the urban intertribal communities. We have a great partnership with the Sigorate Land Trust, and we exchange our foods and seeds and cultural traditions. So this is an aerial picture of the land when we first got it, and it looks quite different today. We've done a lot of work. We have an extraordinary team. Redbird, Edward Willey, a Pomo Wailaki land steward, has been doing wonderful work there. Maya Harjo, Muskogee farmer, has been developing an extraordinary polycultural organic farm with Indigenous heirloom seeds and foods. We've created a seed library. We have a thriving orchard, wildlife preserve, and we're in a capital campaign right now to create a meeting house. And one of the first things we did, because that's what we learned from the local people, is the importance of fire. And now we know fire in the West has been so deadly and frightening and scary lately because of many reasons of climate change and historic mismanagement. And we can debate about many other factors, but we know that the land needs to be tended with good fire, with medicine fire, not to fear fire, but to do regular cultural prescribed burns, which the Native people did all over Turtle Island. So we have had a couple of historic cultural burns that have cleansed the land and replenished nutrients to the soil, eliminated pests and brought back native seeds. And we also work for food sovereignty. We have a thriving 2-acre farm now there that is growing so many delicious foods. We grow tepary beans. We grow about a dozen different varieties of beans, squash, and corn, the 3 sisters. We grow many medicines of different types of tobacco and sages for teas. And we're nourishing communities with nutrient-dense, culturally relevant foods. So we trade, exchange, have giveaways, provide foods to cultural centers. It's been a wonderful thing, especially during the pandemic, to be able to grow good, clean food and share it with our communities. And one other land back is this exciting one, as I mentioned, the symbolic, but more than symbolic, a very sacred site called Sequoia Point in Oakland has been under the Oakland City Council's purview. And they have now opened up land stewardship through a long-term conservation easement with the Segurate Land Trust to take over management, guardianship of this beautiful sacred place in the East Bay. So we're very excited about that. There's going to be a big celebration next week there to have this land returned to the Chochenyo Ohlone people, who are an unrecognized tribe, so that a mayor of a city is recognizing the sovereignty of a Native community without the federal government recognition is quite a statement, and we're so thrilled about that. And another one is the Leech Lake example, and this is where the federal government understood the wrongs of the past, the injustices of taking over 12,000 acres of Leech Lake original treaty lands and expropriating it, and they have returned that in a historic land back to this nation. So we're thrilled about that as well. And it's so exciting. I can't even give you all the examples, but ultimately we are not only about restoring the health of the land and the ecosystems, but restoring the land that was referred to in our introduction. So we're a full circle here. We must restore the land. The land gives us our language and our medicine. It's so important that we have safe spaces to be ourselves, to not have the private property, the possession and ownership of land, but to open up our relationality and our vulnerability and our power to be in that dynamic harmony with these home bases. So I want to close with a simple poem by one of my favorite Ojibwe poets, Margaret Nudine. You may know her work. And it's called Listening. I hear the wind sometimes when the pines sing, Ziziwigwa, when the doors cry, when the windows shake. Then the wind shifts, lets up and slow to a new speed. Now the tent shaker carefully builds his tent, and the wordless whispers begin. The old ones tell us, live as you are named. We sense the truth in our bones, and so we listen. We listen to the land. Thank you so much for listening. My honor to be with you tonight. Miigwech.
Yeah, great. Let's take Melissa Nelson one more time. Herman and Regina Lopez Weissman and her grandchildren for their incredible opening tonight. Please join me. We'd like to answer some questions, and you're going to see some instructions here up on the screen, I believe. It'll tell you how to tap into a website that will give you a chance to send Melissa and I some questions. And so if we could get that up there, that would be wonderful. And while we're doing that, why don't you and I move some chairs over?
Right. One other point, who wants to ask about ally resources? Anyone? No? Good. Because I forgot my last slide was about ally resources. So there's a bunch of listed there. So if you need them, just let me know or let John know and we'll get those to you.
Wonderful. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, some reminders, there are programs out front. This is only the beginning of a 2-day conversation. And tomorrow in the University Center, beginning at 8 a.m., we're going to continue this conversation around many layers of land back. We will have poets, we will have expert panels, we will have artists and student projects being presented. The day is even going to end with an opportunity for you all to work together in a workshop sort of mode to begin imagining for your university what Western's Indigenous commitments should look like. So it's a real opportunity for your voice to be heard across the generations as Western tries to ask these really difficult questions. Melissa, while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I wonder if there's something C. Marie said in her opening, and she talked about ecologically, sort of how are we needed, how are humans needed, and when she said that, it really struck me. You know, I think a lot of the folks in this room maybe hold the view that the earth would be better off without Homo sapiens sapiens, and she disagreed with that. And I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I agree with C. Marie that no, the earth needs humans. We are here for a reason. We're here for a purpose. That's why I fundamentally disagree with the Anthropocene concept as well, because not all humans have created such havoc and destruction on Mother Earth, and that many of us not only haven't destroyed parts of her, we have enhanced her. We have loved her. We have actually created more biodiversity, more, habitat heterogeneity. Indigenous people's land management practices have been able to create lots of biodiversity and different ways of loving the land. So according to our original instructions, we are here to love the land, and we are obligated to, and that Mother Earth needs us. And in fact, an Indigenous perspective of species extinction is, yes, one who destroyed habitat, they were killed off. There are many different obvious reasons why species have gone extinct, but many elders tell us it's because we stopped caring for them, we stopped loving them, we stopped using them in a good way, right? In a reciprocal way, in a balanced way. And so I agree that we need to be here. Humans need to be here. We're earthlings. And we are, I believe, in the inherent goodness of human beings, and that we can relearn to love Mother Earth and love each other. And that it's only been, a couple hundred years of havoc and madness that can be reversed. I think that this is possible.
Thank you. And I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, that land is not just land, right? Land is cosmology, land is medicine, land has personhood, and we're part of that system, and therefore needed. Previous keynote you quoted tonight, Enrique Salmon,
Yes.
says that humans are a keystone species, at least at our best. Here's some questions from the audience, and I thought I'd go through kind of 5 at a time, and you can
5 at a time.
answer the one you want.
Let's do it.
You're going to answer the one you want. It's like a game
All right.
show.
Okay.
Right? You can say
Ding, ding,
rematriation
ding, ding.
for 500.
Okay. All right.
One person asked, can you tell us more about your education and how it's influenced your connection with your Indigenous history? One person asked, yeah, good one.
Cool.
For giving land back, what are some of the policies and regulations, such as the health of the land and that it's right to give back an unhealthy piece of land?
Mhm.
One person asks, how would you describe?
Giganawabi. The knowledge of.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
And then finally, are there, well, I don't know that either of us can answer this, but it's an important question to ask this week. Are there any Indigenous artifacts currently in First Hall here on campus that should be returned to their rightful owners? And so approach those however you like.
Wow.
You choose one. You can
Okay.
capture the essence.
Sure, thank you. Great questions, thank you all. Well, the last one, I know nothing about this university's repatriation compliance and policies, but having worked very actively on that at San Francisco State University with our NAGPRA program, the Name, Embrace, Protection, and Repatriation Act, I think one of the first things a university can do to honor Indigenous rights and rematriation and repatriation is be sure to comply with the NAGPRA law. So I think that's a great question, yes. And then in terms of, I actually would love to hear who proposed that. I don't know that word exactly. I know it has to do with thinking or knowledge, but I don't know the second part of that word. Yeah.
Maybe this one then. Is, you know, the ethics of giving back an unhealthy piece of land.
Yes, this reminds me of some of my teachings back with the urban habitat and the early environmental justice work in the San Francisco Oakland Bay area with Earth Island Institute. And they were doing land back for Black communities with brownfields in Oakland and San Francisco. And we discussed the ethics of it then as well. Like, is it really justice to give back to BIPOC communities toxic land? Really good question. What do you guys think?
Yeah. Yeah, much money. Yeah, a lot of resources.
Right? That is not justice to take a land, destroy a land, toxify a land, and then say, oh, here, now you can have it. But you know what? We'll take it because it's still our land, because somebody's ancestors were there. It has significance. And one example I can think of are the Hawaiian people with Kaho'olawe, an island that was bombed for decades by the US military and pretty much devastated like a wasteland. And there were still unexploded ordinances to this day all over that island. But the Hawaiian people debated and discussed, and they said, you know what? That island was given to us by our gods and goddesses. That island is still part of who we are as Hawaiian people. And so the Kaho'olawe Island Reserve Commission started to restore that island that was bombed for decades. And so there is an example of a Native community saying, yes, it's unjust that it was destroyed and bombed, but we will take it. It's still our land. We can heal the land. The mashkiki of that land is still there. We have to recover it and heal it and restore it.
It reminds me of the Western Shoshone, you know, who had land on the Nevada test site. Folks, you know, think about Hiroshima. The Nevada test site took hundreds of Hiroshimas to do testing over decades, and the Western Shoshone were offered money or the land back. They took the land back.
Exactly.
Let's do another round of 5.
Right?
We'll pick one. Someone says, I feel like I should apologize for my ancestry because I do know I'm related to Spanish conquistadors. Apologize for my ancestors. Someone asked about Devil's Bridge in Sedona, Arizona. Going off here, what you're saying about when you see the word devil in the title.
Right.
How do you change the language in mountain sports? We're going to see Connor Ryan's great film Spirit of the Peaks tomorrow night at 7 in the University Center Theater. How do you change the language in mountain sports so that those sports are less about conquer, more about an emotional, spiritual experience? In your experience, what are the most essential elements of a successful land-back relationship? And you go more into the history of rematriating the land, and how this concept began. So,
Wow.
rematriating,
Hmm.
elements of success, language and mountain sports, Devil's Bridge, or apologies for ancestors. We'll put them all at 500.
I'll start with successful land back.
For 500.
For 500. Maybe that.
For land.
Yes, yes. We'll start a land campaign. Boy, again, there's no one size fits all for land back. We always have to look at the local Indigenous community who that is their ancestral lands. They should be the leader of that land back movement. And so in order to do that, there needs to be a process, right? And we have to slow way down. And so, you know, sometimes in our society, especially with real estate, it's like, let's just get to raise the money, put a down payment, slam it down, And some land backs may happen like that. I haven't seen any successfully that have occurred like that. The most successful ones to me are built on long-term relationship building. And what Willie Ermine, a wonderful Cree leader from Canada, calls the ethical space of engagement. The ethical space of engagement when, say, a settler landowner has a 500-acre ranch. They know it, they find artifacts there, there's rock art there, they read history books, it's maybe from here, Southern Ute land. They need to develop a relationship with the Southern Ute. And that is a long-term process. And it may involve apology, it may involve forgiveness, it may involve providing land and money. It may be bringing in an attorney to help with it. So you can't just give land back without a lot of other resources. As we learned in our little 8 acres of Heron Shadow, it took so much work by so many people. And so building good reciprocal ethical relationships through a ceremonial process of gift exchange really helps set the tone so that we say you move at the speed of trust. And you move at the speed of trust and you slowly build relationships and listen very deeply. Yeah. So there's also rules and regulations. You do need a gaggle of attorneys to help with it all. So you need money, you need donations. But again, if you set the intention, I think that's what I mean, set the intention and make sure the relationships are righteous from the beginning, and then anything's possible.
I almost wonder, we need to take a break from using the word success. That's different from the speed of trust we're talking about.
And outcomes.
Rather than relations.
Yeah.
3 more rounds, if that's okay.
Let's do it.
All right.
You guys having fun?
Okay. How can allies support land rematriation? What do you envision the land back movement look like in 5 years or 10? How do we begin navigating, feeling a sense of home and our own identities with colonial heritage?
Wow, great question.
What ways as a white European descendant can we integrate ourselves into learning from First Nations tribes without overstepping our boundaries? I apologize, it was the poet's name and the poet's, Melissa's poet's good. I'll do that one real quick.
Margaret Newton.
Margaret Newton, Noodin.
And I want to close those with one of her other.
Oh, great, okay. Yeah, so.
Wow, where to start?
That's come up a couple of times,
Yeah. Well, that's why I had a whole list, and maybe we'll pull it up at some point, of ally resources and toolkits, because that always comes up. That's why I had a whole slide dedicated to it. Let's see, Yeah, how to be a good ally without overstepping our boundaries? That's a great question. I think being of service and listening and just stepping away and knowing when you're needed and wanted and knowing when you're not needed or not wanted. And I think deep within the psyche of America, with our, kind of Judeo-Christian background in our schools and even really our governments, there's this, what we call the savior complex. It's built in our philanthropy and even a lot of nonprofit world of, wanting to save others. And I think the intention to help people and compassion and empathy is so important, but it gets to be a gray zone where that compassion and empathy to support you can get into, overzealousness or meddling or like, oh, we know what's best for you. We can help you. Here, let me give you this. Let me give you that. Right? We all know that when we have a problem and we just want a friend to listen to us, but they're like, here's a solution and do A through Z and this and that. We're like, no, I just like, can you just hear me for a minute? And so similarly, to be a good ally settler, we've been through a lot. Our people have been through a lot. We have internalized trauma, we have historical trauma, we've suffered oppression, microaggressions that are ongoing. And so even though you may have the best of intentions for wanting to help, always just be like, I can offer, and then let it be, right? So I think standing your own ground, offering support when you can, and if it's asked and if it's needed, go for it. And if it's not, that's the boundary. Yeah, is that clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the analogy of when your friend just wants you to listen, you start offering. That's really nice.
Yeah.
Ready for 6? How to ensure a more inclusive perspective when dealing with Indigenous land management. I think they be different from mining, construction, engineering industry. Another person asks, can you define the difference between land back as returning land entirely versus land back as creating collaboration and access? Yeah, this person's family owns land and it shouldn't be created. I would like the opportunity to still live on and learn to steward the land. Is it possible within the land back movement? How would I start? I might tie into the land trust examples. What prophecy are elders talking about or warning us about now? Can you tell us more about the elders' view on how they see the rest of humanity going? Just small questions.
Yeah, wow.
How can you find out if you have native ancestry? So
Holy moly,
Yeah.
that was quite a set.
discovering native ancestry, prophecy, it's someone whose family owns land, right? Returning land versus creating collaboration access, and ensuring that inclusive perspective.
Right, gosh, those are also good. Go back 1 or 2. Yeah, I think the one about land ownership there.
The person whose family owns land.
Yes, right.
Would like the opportunity to still live on and learn to steward the land. Is that possible within the land back movement?
Yeah. Again, land back means so many different things to each people. If you have 20 native people up here, we're probably all going to have a different answer to this, right? I mean, we'll have the basic main meaning, but how and what? So for me, opening up access to land and having co-management, if the native people have the 51% vote over veto power over how the land is managed, that's native led. And if it's native led and the native community feels like they can visit, they can live there, they can access their plant medicines there, they can plant there, they can have a gathering there. They don't need to have a piece of paper from, the county that says they own the land. In fact, some traditional tribes, like the traditional Seminole, when I first came onto the Cultural Conservancy 30 years ago, Attorney Claire Cummings was working with the traditional Seminole tribe of Florida who were ethically opposed to land ownership according to private property law. And they said, we cannot own land in this private property paradigm, but we need to have relationship to our land again. So how can we have access and relationship to our land without having personal property rights? So I agree with that, and I think Segurite Land Trust agrees with that, because this Sequoia Point, they're not claiming land, private property over that land. They are developing in perpetuity conservation easement and an access agreement and a land use agreement, where the Segurite Land Trust has 100% native control over how that land is managed, without necessarily having the title to that land under private property law. So I characterize that as land back in even a more significant way, because sometimes owning land with private property is a violation of our original instructions. And I remember hearing from a Pomo elder that he said, even if we do, for legal purposes, for our sovereignty, accept legal title to the land, to absorb it as private property, we need to do a ceremony to end private property. We need a ceremony to kind of like bury the concept of land possession and land ownership, and reawaken and reopen that relationship, which is based on stewardship and rematriation.
So would you say that that means land back requires a view of land back?
Well, a view and a tangible relationship. It requires, how tangible is a piece of paper, a title, right? I mean, for us, we've made paper so important, but that paper can burn up. What is the relationship to that land? Like in a marriage, not that we're married, but you know, we have a piece of paper, we lose that piece of paper, that has nothing to do with this relationship. And so it's a formality under Western law, but again, it's not honoring Indigenous law. And under Indigenous law, our quote ownership, it's not ownership, it's that relationship, it's stewardship, it's guardianship, it's protection, it's obligation, it's nourishment, it's medicine, it's all these other things. It's not possession and ownership, which private property law actually expresses.
Thank you. Final round,
Okay,
and then a poem.
okay,
Yeah.
let's do it.
All right. What does Indigenous land battles, let's see here. Why do Indigenous land battles take decades before mediation? This person's Indigenous friends often suggest Euro-Americans find their own Indigenous ancestry and reconnect to their own home through this. Would you consider this an important part of land back? How? Do you feel Indigenous teachings and traditional ecological knowledge should help to inform a shift in modern ethics, nurture equity and ecology? How can the balance?
Yes, that was an easy one.
Yeah, yes.
Yes.
We're done.
Yeah, yes, that was, yeah.
How can the balance be restored between Indigenous people and the people visiting reservations? Just like the Paiute people that are there examples of land back initiatives in areas where Native people no longer live? Many places in Colorado, for example, like the Arkansas River Valley, former Ute tribal lands. Could you share about the nutritional justice and the famous Native food? Rye bread. Two more.
Infamous, yeah.
Infamous.
Famous and infamous.
It was in quotes, right?
Uh-huh.
For those of us not from Native tribes, but from this land or displaced from lands in Europe or elsewhere, how do we magically and powerfully grieve for our collective land losses? And since Native people never owned land in the traditional sense, what you were just talking about, how does land back movement deal with ownership? Ownership, that European displacement, right, Red?
I've read, that goes on.
Land back, where Native peoples no longer live. The balance between Indigenous people and the people visiting reservations. TDK, as a driver of equitable ethics. Europeans primarily reduces ancestry, and why it often takes so long.
Wow, wow.
Your choice.
All right, let's go back here. Go ahead.
right. Oops, there you go.
I think this one, that one right there. Yes, so our current US President, Joe Biden, and the White House in the last year have come up with many policy recommendations, including the respect for Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge within all federal agencies. Has anyone read or heard that? It's historic. It is, I mean, it makes me cry actually to hear a US president, of course, Deb Haaland is our first Native woman Secretary of Interior, woo, woo, and also our first National Park Service Director, Sam Vaughn, the third, you know, to help with those decisions. But it's pretty historic and monumental that we have at the highest level of government recommendations for our federal agencies, US Forest Service, BLM, National Park Service, et cetera, to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge in all land management. I am so excited by that. And there was also just something that came out last week with a group of tribal leaders who met in Washington at the White House to also honor Indigenous knowledge systems across the policies that deal with Native affairs through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is just monumental. So this question, how do you feel Indigenous teachings and TK should help to inform a shift in modern ethics to nurture equity and ecology? It is happening. So it is already happening. It's happening at universities, it's happening at the federal level, it's happening certainly through the private conservation movement. I'm sure many of you are here from environmental organizations that are looking at partnerships with local tribes. It's happening intellectually in universities. I'm in the Global Futures Laboratory at the School of Sustainability at the Walton Center for Planetary Health. Helping lead an Indigenous knowledge's focal area, and I meet with scientists from all walks of life who are like, yeah, Indigenous knowledge, we have to do this like a real science. This is the future of ecology, the future of sustainability. So I'm very heartened and very hopeful. We have a lot of work to do still. There's still a lot of barriers and obstacles, but we're on the right track. So a big yes to this. From the grassroots and from the top down, it's starting to change. And I'm really, really thrilled about that.
That's exciting. And what an item of hope to begin to close on. You maybe think, maybe for some folks in the audience, they're starting to see it. Land back is not just about land back, and land's not just land, it's a way of knowing on land.
Yes.
It's a return of language on
The
land.
languages. Yeah.
So I guess in closing, before you share another moving poem, how might you reframe land back to help people who just see it as giving physical land back or rename land back, to kind of crack open a rigid view of land back so folks can start to see it as all the forms of agency and all the kinds of things coming back in land back that you're talking about?
I think I may go metaphysical on that one.
All right.
I think we have to embrace land back within ourselves. We are land. We are stardust. The carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen in our every cell comes from the land and comes from the stars. So it's not like we are separate and outside of the land. We are some master agent that can take land and like monopoly pieces and move things around. We have to have presence to understand that we are the land, right? And that we are part of the land. And so having that sense of presence in ourselves metaphysically is so important. Dan Longboat, a Mohawk leader, talks about how a imagination in the Western Euro-American sense, we think is in our mind. He says, imagination is in the land. And when we're open, the creative powers of the earth come into us, and then we can be imaginative. So the point is to just problematize the subject-object duality that is such an obstacle, and that Native people, for various reasons, our metaphysics is that to understand we are part of the land. And so the equity and justice will come when we work in partnership with those people who understand they are the land. And so to help mend those injustices by returning land back to the rightful owners,
Land back.
land back and land back. But it doesn't, yeah,
Keep talking.
okay, all right.
Please keep talking.
So, yeah, that's where I would kind of go with that it's more, I think why people really like the word rematriation also, because it's a returning to, again, the sacred feminine, this hyper heteropatriarchal society. People feel we are imbalanced, right? And there needs to be a rebalancing. And so when you talk about rematriating seeds, rematriating languages, rematriating stories from, wax cylinder recordings and the Smithsonian, you talk about rematriating sacred clothing, regalia that has been in museums, locked up. So that term rematriation, and we have to rematriate it back to ourselves, land back to ourselves. Yeah.
That's incredible. While you the poem reminded me of Robin Wall Kimmer's quote. She says that biodiversity is the Earth's imagination.
I think this poem may address also a lot of your fabulous questions. Thank you. It's called The Way We Meet. Long ago in the mixing, we were shaken in every direction, different children of the sky and of the land. To survive now, we must be at peace in our hearts, understand one another, and bravely remember we are all, one by one, cousins. Let's meet one another, here, now, on earth, before we become heavenly ancestors, wearing a necklace of stars, visible to our heirs. Miigwech.